I will speak about the reform of the Psalter, in the Roman breviary. The subject is from a complete Psalter to an easier Psalter, an insight into the dynamics of the liturgical reforms in the 20th century, at the example of praying the Psalms. The Psalms are an indispensable part of the prayer of the Church and the basic substance of everyday non-Eucharistic liturgical prayer, the core of so-called hours of the divine office. They constitute the oldest layer of the liturgy. Also, because only in their case we can state with certainty that they were part of Jesus' personal prayer in his earthly life. Their composition in the book of Psalms is a reminder of the order of liturgy of the First Covenant, which in precisely this respect was treated as own heritage by the first Christians and the ancient Church. From its very beginning, the Church regarded the Psalms as privileged and irreplaceable way of fulfilling the command to pray ceaselessly. Albeit either almost literary exempli gratia by the Desert Fathers, or at least through appointment of fixed recurring times of day and night, day and night prayer. For many centuries, the Psalms, ordered in the books of the divine service and recited in the times that determined the daily rhythm of the whole Christian world, constituted the main point of reference for prayer of all the faithful, both the clergy and the laymen. In the popular piety, however, they were obscured in the course of time by the equivalents of Ave Maria and Pater Noster, or even substituted with the whole variety of private devotions and spiritual exercises, remaining as the breviary the daily bread only for the clergymen and the monks. Hence, in the modern age, the breviary became the priest's prayer, and the picture of a clergyman saying his breviary, of course in Latin, but more and more often privately, somewhere in the outside, for example in the garden, entered the collective imagination of the Christian societies as one of the attributes of this specific vocation. Moreover, though the laymen were rather reluctant to make use of the breviary, they were nevertheless aware of the fact that in a way it provided the clergyman with spiritual vigor. No wonder that the misbehaving priests were mockingly described as those who deny themselves neither the cognac nor the breviary. It is idiom in Polish. Ksiądz, który brewiarza i koniaku nie odmawia. Hence, the breviary was regarded both as the clergyman's privilege and their duty. If we are to follow here the praise of modern reforms of the Roman breviary, or strictly speaking of its core, that is the Psalter, in the beginning, let's pose the question: what kind of breviary was used by the Catholic priests of the Roman Rite at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries? Well, this question is easy to answer. It must have been the Roman breviary codified in 1568 by St. Pius V, compatible with the last typical edition issued in 1631 by Urban VIII and renewed by Leo XIII. In fact, this Tridentine breviary was much older than this general description seems to suggest. For as in the case of the Roman Missal of 1570, the post-Tridentine reform basically had only expanded on the whole church the rules of the prior that for centuries had been established within the local church of the Papal Rome. The backbone of the breviary of St. Pius V, that is its psalmody, was hardly any different from the oldest forms of the Roman office we know from the 5th and 6th centuries. In accordance with a long tradition, having no alternative within the Roman Rite, the Psalter was distributed over 1 week, to some psalms recurred downright daily. St. Pius V wished this basic scheme of the weekly psalmody to constitute the main content of the divine service. Therefore, he made, on the one hand, the votive offices, like the little office of the Blessed Virgin Mary, non-compulsory. And on the other hand, he severely limited the celebrations of the saints. The priest, reciting the Roman breviary in the end of the 19th or in the very beginning in the 20th century, used precisely such a Tridentine liturgical book based on the Psalter of 2 saint popes, Gregory the Great and Pius V. However, paradoxically, it is not so easy to determine how his breviary prior actually looked like. For in the course of the centuries that elapsed from 1568 to the end of the Belle Epoque, a number of factors appeared which made the practice of saying the breviary highly complicated. In the first place, these were the factors related to an increasing number of commemorations of saints within the liturgical calendar, and then with further and further subordination of the current office to those commemorations, usually marked with one of the schemes from the Commune Sanctorum. In case of psalmody, it meant, in fact, substituting the complete Psalter with much narrower choice of festive psalms. At the end of the 19th century, this rather unplanned and uncontrolled domination of the Sanctorale, related, after all, to the constant accumulation of various feasts, was accompanied by yet another move which deeply changed the very logic of the office. Willing to avoid overburdening of the clergy with the breviary prior, in 1883, Pope Leo XIII granted a general indult, according to which almost throughout the whole liturgical year it was allowed to substitute the current office with the votive offices foreseen for subsequent ferias: Monday of the Holy Angels, Tuesday of the Holy Apostles, Wednesday of St. Joseph, Thursday of the Blessed Sacrament, Friday of the Lord's Passion, Saturday of the Immaculate Conception. Taking into consideration the complexity of the system of feasts of that time, it is understandable that the possibility of saying throughout the week simply of subsequent votive offices, characterized by clear devotional motives, was a tempting solution due to its simplicity or rememberable ordering. But in the same time, both these factors, i.e., domination of the sanctorale and substitution of the current office with the votive offices, led to continuous repetition of the Sunday psalmody in lauds and to very frequent repetition of various Sunday psalms in Vespers. Hence, only a little portion of the Psalter was actually used. Moreover, most of the psalms appeared very rarely, while a limited set of around 10 psalms was in constant use. And yet, the breviary Psalter as such had not been so far narrowed down. In theory, it still comprised 150 psalms distributed over the course of 1 week. Besides, the problem was not only in actual limitation of the number of psalms. Another difficulty was related to the fact that both in case of domination of the sanctorale and of constant use of the votive offices, some objective order of the Psalter, basically sustained within the weekly office, gave place to various subjective configurations. Shortly speaking, instead of reciting the psalms according to their sequence in the Psalter, without selecting them to fit some particular motifs and moods, they were most often recited precisely in such a selection and sequence that was related to some specific motifs or attitudes. Such were the challenges faced by St. Pius X, who became a pope in 1903. Convinced of the necessity to arouse and shape the piety through the liturgy of the Church, he started to bring out basic structures of the liturgical heritage, sometimes completely obscured by later additions. Two motifs were closely intertwined in this work: return to the primacy of seasons and Sundays within the liturgical year, and restoration of the practice of saying the complete Psalter within a week. Here we will discuss this second issue. In the Apostolic Constitution, Divino Afflato, of 1st November 1911, St. Pius X reminds of the ancient law that obliges the clergy to recite the whole Psalter within a week. The Pope states that it is his intention to restore this practice in such a way that, on the one hand, would not cause any diminution in the cultus of saints, and on the other, would make the burden of the office not more oppressive, but actually lighter for the clergy. Having both these issues in mind, the Pope had appointed the commission consisting of learned and active men who prepared a new arrangement of the Psalter. As a consequence, the Holy Father decided to abolish the order of the Psalter as it is at present in the Roman Breviary, and to absolutely forbid the use of it. After 1st January 1913, commanding to use the new arrangement of the Psalter from now on, the Pope proclaims that those who disobey this order will be punished. He concludes, all such are to know that they will not be satisfying this grave duty of reciting the canonical hours every day, unless they use this hour disposition of the Psaltery. In practice, the severity of this regulation was eased by the indults, which allowed to use the old arrangement of the Psalter in private recitation. Obviously, this new arrangement of the Psalter radically broke off with the ordering of the psalmody as it had been within the Roman breviary of St. Pius V. Although continuity was preserved, for example, in case of Vespers, the order of this breviary Psalter was actually new. Moreover, it was a novelty also in comparison to the older pre-Tridentine offices of the Roman Rite, nowhere in the history of the Roman psalmody, even reaching to its oldest versions we know, coming from the 5th and 6th centuries, can we find the basis and the antecedents for the Psalter of 1911. In the same time, there exists a clear continuity between those ancient forms and the breviary of 1568. Hence, we are safe to say that the number of psalms in loads of Sundays or ferial days had never been lower than 12. That usually the morning office had comprised 8 psalms, including 3 Laudate psalms and Psalm 50th. The latter from the 6th century had been recited almost daily. That parts of Psalm 118 had dominated prime and other minor hours throughout the whole week. That from the very beginning Compline had included 3 defined psalms: 4, 19, 133, used throughout the whole week. All these points have been truly modified by the Psalter of 1911. The solutions it proposed more or less radically abandoned the own tradition of the Roman office. This fairly controversial move was made because the clergy of that time felt somewhat overburdened by the office. The attempt was therefore made to reduce this burden by proposing a well-balanced psalter based on the principle that each psalm should be recited generally no more than once a week. Hence, the reform of the breviary introduced by St. Pius X can be regarded as an adjustment of the office to the longing for change, a result of the struggle with the weariness. It is worth to recall the words by a distinguished expert in history of divine office, Father Robert Taft, who summarized these changes in a following way. Citation: "For anyone with a sense of the history of the office, this was a shocking departure from almost universal Christian tradition." Over 30 years after the introduction of a new arrangement of the Psalter by St. Pius X, another pope, Pius XII, introduced a new Latin translation of psalms into liturgical usage. In his motu proprio in Quotidianis Precibus of 25th March 1945, the Pope firstly speaks rather guardedly of inaccuracies and deficits of the vulgate translations of the Psalms. Reading between the lines of the document, we may say that the Pope considers them increasingly annoying, especially when compared to the new translations, which are based on original texts and take advantage of progress in the knowledge of ancient languages, as well as of modern methods of textual criticism. The Pope is aware that the Vulgate Psalter is deeply rooted within Christian tradition and that it had affected the way the Holy Fathers and doctors had commented the Psalms. Nevertheless, expectations of the priests, a good many of them, as well as demands of the learned men, bishops and cardinals, convinced the Holy Father to give an order that a new Latin translation of the Psalms is prepared. On the one hand, it was to follow the original text precisely and faithfully. On the other, as far as it was possible, it had to take into account the venerable Vulgate, as well as other ancient translations referring to sound critical norms whenever there would be differences between them. The document then states that the new version has already been completed with the diligence befitting such a task by the professors of the Pontifical Biblical Institute. Hence, the Pope offers it to all who have the obligation to recite the canonical hours daily and permits them to use it, should they wish to do so, in either private or public recitation. As it is indicated in a few times in the document, the main aim of the whole undertaking was to enable those praying with the new Psalter to grasp more fully what is said in the Holy Book. The Pope emphasizes that he is driven by pastoral concerns. He wishes the Psalms to be recited not only with sincere devotion, but with fuller understanding as well. Still, in the document itself, there is a supposition that there are times when, even after every help that text criticism and the knowledge of languages can offer has been exhausted, the meaning of the words is still not perfectly clear. In such cases, their more definite clarification will have to be left to future study. This papal regulation led to an unheard of syllable. Thank you. Was to coexist in the liturgy of the Church together with the Vulgate version, unless everybody should wish to accept this new translation. Thus, pursuant to the Pope's decision, the daily prayer of the Church comprised henceforth the monuments of two very much different mentalities. Firstly, Psalterium Gallicanum, a witness to the patristic Septuagint option, and an object of centuries-old reflection. Secondly, a suddenly developed product of academic research, evaluated only on the basis of its fidelity to the Hebrew original and its classicism of style. Regardless of the impracticality of such a dualism, this solution created an impression for the second time within a few decades that the true reform is not about revision, but about creation. For the question arises whether it was really impossible to correct the Vulgate version instead of creating a brand new translation. Since the times of St. Pius X, the Benedictines from the Roman Abbey of St. Hieronymus had been preparing a revision of Vulgate. Despite this, Pius XII decided to promote in liturgical usage a new translation prepared at the Pontifical Biblical Institute. However, the Jesuits from the Institute did not restrict themselves to capturing correctly the Hebrew too, Veritas Hebraica. But while preparing this new version, they shaped its language after distinctly classical style, somewhat distancing themselves from the specificity of Christian Latin. Their Psalter sounded like the works of Cicero, whose Latin was certainly more classical than that of St. Hieronymus. Moreover, their translation did not take into account the requirements of singing the psalms in choir and in accordance with the principles of Gregorian chant. Immediately after the release of this document of Pius XII, and in later church publications, there appeared, of course, loud voices of gratitude to the Pope for his approval of the new version of the Psalter, deemed as the sovereign gesture made when supreme good of Christian life demands it. However, it is hard to prove that prior to this reform, a conviction that the Vulgate posed a major threat to Christian life had really been widespread. Regardless of opinion one may have in the debate whether the version prepared at the Biblical Institute was indeed such a progress in translation, there is also another problematic issue. In the light of the principle of the organic development, the will to improve some aspect of the liturgy is not a sufficient reason to question the existing tradition. What is needed is the moral certainty that such an undertaking is indispensable for the benefit of spiritual life. On the eve of the Second Vatican Council, the planned reform of the breviary, hence also introduction of a new arrangement of the Psalter, was one of the most widely discussed issues. In 1957, Pius XII appointed a commission that surveyed a number of bishops on this matter. The Roman Liturgical Congregation had already had some concrete projects in its closets, waiting to make use of them. The Council's constitution, Sacrosanctum Concilium, promulgated on the 4th December 1963, in its 4th chapter devoted to Roman breviary, states that the restoration of this liturgical book, so happily begun by the Apostolic See, is introduced in order that the divine office may be better and more perfectly prayed in existing circumstances, whether by priests or by other members of the Church, which, in turn, is meant to sanctify the day. The Council Fathers were clearly motivated by the wish formulated by the commission appointed by Pius XII. The traditional sequence of the hours is to be restored so that once again they may be genuinely related to the time of the day when they are prayed, taking the pastoral conditionings into account. As far as the above-mentioned traditional sequence of the hours is concerned, the Council decided to accept a compromise. The emphasis was put on Lauds and Vespers, also Compline and Matins were preserved, the latter lost in its nocturnal character, with the exception of cases when celebrated in choir. While in case of daytime prayers, double standards were accepted, other for celebration in choir and other for celebration outside choir. And the hour of prime was suppressed. Having defined the hours, the Constitution moves on to the directive meant to enable the faithful to celebrate the office, as we have read, better and more perfectly. True, afterwards, it occurs that the Council describes this celebration also with two other adjectives: more extensively and easily. Here we come to the regulation that is directly related to the issue analyzed in this lecture. The Article 91 of Sacrosanctum Concilium says, so that it may really be possible in practice to observe the course of the hours proposed in Article 89, the psalms are no longer to be distributed throughout 1 week, but through some longer period of time. The work of revising the Psalter, already happily begun, is to be finished as soon as possible and is to take into account the style of Christian Latin, the liturgical use of psalms also when sung, and the entire tradition of the Latin Church. Those two statements concerning the change of distribution of psalms and the revision of the text defined further frames and directions of the reform of the breviary Psalter. Also, during the whole of the 20th century, the reform of the breviary had somewhat been the engine for the reform of also other liturgical books. Post-Vatican reform of this, post-conciliar reform of this very book lasted rather long and was completed only after the reform of the Missal and many rites from the Roman pontifical or the Roman ritual. The decree of the Congregation of Divine Worship, promulgating the typical edition of the Liturgy of the Hours according to the Roman rite, was issued on the 11th April 1971. Together with Liturgy of the Hours, which was the new book of the office, also newly arranged Psalter was introduced. It is worth noting that already before, in 1969, the Pontifical Commission for the New Vulgate, headed by Cardinal Augustin Bea, had published a revised Latin translation of the Book of Psalms, destined for the new book of the office. Without going here into the comparative analysis of the three Latin versions of Psalms, that of Vulgate, that of the Paean Commission, and that of Neo-Vulgate, let's only say that Neo-Vulgate translation turned out to be a way conciliatory toward the ancient tradition, certainly to a larger extent than the translation issued by the Paean Commission by Cardinal Bea. Nevertheless, let's now move on to discuss the new order of the Psalter. Due to changes in the arrangement of the hours, it was a precise wish of the Council to distribute psalms not throughout 1 week, but through some longer period of time. Behind this statement, there was a recurring thought of the Psalter distributed over 2 weeks, as for example in the Ambrosian Rite. But in the end, the Psalter was arranged into a 4-week cycle, model that was taken from the Book of Common Prayer of the Anglican Church. It means in practice that the majority of the psalms is used in prayer once a month, while before each of them had recurred no less than once a week. The Liturgy of the Hours has kept the procedure of dividing the psalms, introduced by the Roman Breviary of 1911. Now it has been used to a similar extent, but in many cases the psalms have been divided differently. The new Psalter is not a complete one. Among the eliminated texts, there were both a few psalms in their entirety, 57, 82, and 108, as well as those parts of 19 other psalms that, due to their imprecatory nature, could have created a certain psychological difficulty. Such a move had no precedent in the history of the Roman Breviary. It is known among the Reformed communities. Each psalm in the Psalter of the Liturgy of the Hours have been given a caption explaining its meaning and its import for the personal life of the believer, and accompanied by a quotation from the New Testament or the Fathers of the Church to foster prayer in the light of Christ's new revelation. To the latter addition was some novelty. It had been deeply rooted in Christian tradition of understanding the Psalms. The number of the canticles from the Old Testament has been significantly increased, from 17 to 26. The canticles already used in lauds have been modified. Their texts have been shortened or elaborately cut inside. As a novelty, canticles from the New Testament have been introduced to Vespers. Of course, the fundamentally new arrangement of the Psalter has caused new distribution of psalms among particular offices. As in case of the Roman Breviary of 1911, Matins, renamed now to the Office of Readings, underwent the biggest changes. The number of psalms within each celebration has been diminished from 9 to 3. The arrangement of psalms has been completely changed. The same may be said of lauds, that from now have comprised not 5 but 3 psalms, selected on a completely different basis. The psalmodic structure of the minor hours, both of the 3 traditional ones and of the new middle hour, has remained the same, consisting of 3 psalms, but the selection of psalms had been brand new. While the reform of 1911 changed an earlier arrangement of the Vespers psalms only to a very limited extent, in the Liturgy of the Hours of 1971, a true revolution has been made. The number of psalms in each Vespers has been diminished from 5 to 2, or to 3 if we count also the canticle from the New Testament. The psalms have been distributed among the days of the week in a way that was unfamiliar, both to the earlier tradition and to reform of 1911. Shortly speaking, the Psalter offered by the Liturgy of the Hours of 1971 has little in common with earlier tradition of the prior of the Church, neither in terms of distribution of psalms over the time, nor in relation to the number of psalms within particular offices, nor in case of its completeness. Let's make an attempt to summarize briefly a historical evolution of the Psalter used in the office of the Roman Rite. From the earliest times, the Roman Rite preserved the principle of reciting the entire Psalter within 1 week of the ordinary. It meant that each psalm was to be recited principally once a week, with the exception of those psalms that were recited more often, even daily. 1 week cycle of the Psalter was sustained in the Roman Breviary 1911 in such a way that actually excluded the possibility of saying some psalms more often than once a week. Meanwhile, in case of the Liturgia Orarum from 1971, due to distributing the Psalter over the course of 4 weeks, the majority of the psalms is recited once a month, with the exception of a few that recur weekly in Compline. From the earliest times, there were 8 canonical hours within the Psalter of the office of the Roman Rite: Matin, Lauds, Prime, Terce, Sexts, None, Vespers, and Compline. This was changed only in Liturgia Orarum 1971, when Prime has been suppressed and the rest of the minor hours can be, if recited outside choir, substituted with one prior, so-called middle hour. Hence, in practice, the office may be narrowed down to 5 canonical hours. From the earliest times, each and every psalm had its place within the office, including those texts that had been the most likely to raise some reluctance or evoke questions. From the earliest times, there was no practice of dividing the psalms in the Roman rite, with the exception of Psalm 118. In all other cases, they were recited in their entirety. Meanwhile, since Roman Breviary 1911, division of psalms has become a frequent solution, leading to situations where one psalm, divided in 3 parts, may fill out the whole hour. From the earliest times, the number of psalms on weekdays was never lower than in matins, lower than 12, while on Sundays was even higher. In the beginning, it was twice as much, 24. While from the 6th century to 1911, there were 18 psalms in the office. Only Roman Breviary of 1911 equalized the number of psalms in Sunday at everyday psalmody, diminishing it to 9. Such an equality has been sustained in Liturgia Orarum of 1971. However, the number of psalms in matins was further lowered to 3 psalms, or to 3 units of 1 psalm. From the earliest times up to Roman Breviary 1911, nothing had changed in selection of psalms assigned to particular days of the week in matins. But in the 20th century, this selection was changed practically completely, twice. In Roman Breviary 1911 and Liturgia Orarum 1971. The same we can speak about Psalmody of Lauds and also about the Vespers. The long tradition standing behind Prime does not change the fact that its psalmody was subjected to numerous modifications throughout the centuries. Nevertheless, some of its characteristic features concerning the selection of psalms had been generally preserved either until Roman Breviary 1911 or even until the reform of 1971. But elimination of prime, ordered by the Second Vatican Council, has ended its career within Liturgia Orarum. Throughout the centuries, from the oldest sources to Roman Breviary 1568, there was some kind of admirable changelessness in the structure and selection of the Psalmody of Vespers. Also, Breviarium Romanum 1911 to a larger extent preserved this tradition, but Liturgia Orarum of 1971 has introduced a sudden and multi-dimensional change. Number of the elements of the psalmody has been lowered down from 5 to 3. One of psalms has been substituted with a canticle from the New Testament. Selection of psalms has ceased to show any continuity with previous outstandingly long tradition. Exceptional is the case of Sunday, where among others the primacy of Messianic Psalm 109 has been preserved. And conclusion. The analysis presented above has reminded of and shed some light on a very strange fact. It wasn't until the 20th century that nearly all major modifications of the psalmody of the office of the Roman Rite took place. Is there any real justification for this tsunami which practically blew off centuries-old combinations of the psalmody structure, achieving it in two outbursts? Both those massive changes, the one of 1911 and that of 1971, were prepared and ordered by the supreme authority of the Church, aided by its most learned experts. In both cases, they were based on a conviction that existing arrangement of psalmody was ill-adapted to life and pastoral burdens of the clergy, especially of the lay priests. In both cases, the reformers acted with a specific good in mind, a good they deemed as supreme in the light of the office's nature, and to which they subjected all other values. In 1911, such a supreme good of the reform was to achieve a balanced arrangement of exactly 150 psalms per week, an arrangement that was to substitute both the monotony of the votive offices and the commune sanctorum, as well as the truly traditional arrangement that was regarded as too heavy. 60 years later, yet another solutions were introduced, based on the assumption that each hour should be recited in its proper part of the day, in accordance with the horary nature of the office, which goal was to be achieved almost at any cost. The reformers were ready to pay the price of, firstly, far-reaching modifications of the psalmody structure and selection, and secondly, of reduction in number of hours. 40 years after the second of these 20th century reforms, we may pose a question whether those forced reorganizations actually brought the intended results. It does not seem that we are any closer to the far-reaching aim of the restoring frequent celebration of the hours as the public prayer of the church community. But most probably it wasn't the reform's priority. Such postulates also were raised at that time. However, the reform was made above all with regard to the standard of private recitation of the office by individual priests or by other members of the church. Hence, the question arises whether such unprecedented reduction, one may say rarefaction, of the psalmody used in the divine service had really enabled those who celebrate it daily to sanctify the day to a greater extent than generations of priests who for centuries had used heavier breviaries and thicker portions of Psalter. Is the horary nature of the office more respected today than it was before the reform? Even if, what is not so obvious, presently it had become a norm in private recitation to celebrate lauds in the morning, vespers and the end of the day, and compline at bedtime, is it really so much different from previous stages where the priests, increasingly aware of the need of sanctify the day, had also had to struggle with matins and prime? After all, suppression of prime and reaping matins of their nocturnal, early morning character were a bit like breaking a thermometer. In order to sanctify various times of day, some hours of prayer were simply eliminated. Detaching matins from its traditional time of prayer in a way legitimized the fact that it had often been ignored. Certainly, there are reasons to believe that prime, as ancient as it was, had only been a duplication of loads, somewhat out of place within the morning. Hence, the radical act of suppressing it could have been inevitable. But even if such was the case, then why in practice, not in theory, the whole series of minor hours has been erased in one move. They had filled the day with numerous references to the mysteries of Christ and the apostolic history of the Church. Of course, one could find a variety of answers to each of these questions, both in the documents by the post-conciliar concilium for the reform of the liturgy and in the surveys gathered during earlier consultations of 1957. But it is the fact that the considered and comprehensive project by the commission appointed by Pius XII in 1948 made effort not to, let's be frank, destroy so much as it later happened. Even to both the 1911 Psalter of St. Pius X and the 1945 Psalter of Pius XII had significantly disturbed the sense of tradition, contrasting it with the aspirations of modernity, to arrange things more efficiently at work them out academically. But it is the Psalter of Liturgy of the Hours of 1971 that proves literally in every possible way that those responsible for its preparation followed as far as possible each and every idea which could have been justified in one way or another and led simultaneously to a reduction of the number of hours, abrupt decrease in the number of psalms within each hour, and advanced rarefaction of the Psalter, or even elimination of particular psalms or their individual verses. Hence, there is no reason to pretend that Liturgia Orarum of 1971, when compared to the entire previous tradition of the office of the Roman Rite, does not seem as a multidimensional, massive transgression. Unless we are to accept that it proved its fidelity to tradition already by the very fact of preserving a traditional sequence of the hours as such, despite the atmosphere of cultural evolution of 1968, hostile towards any truly substantial ritual. Among a good many of specific solutions that led to the above-mentioned effects, it is perhaps the case of so-called imprecatory psalms that reveals the mentality standing behind the Liturgy of the Hours and its 4-week Psalter. As we know, in order to avoid psychological difficulties, it was decided to eliminate meticulously, even by rephrasing some psalms, those parts that could have sounded too harsh when translated into national languages. Of course, the reformers were aware of the fact that those texts had also been inspired by God, and as such had their place within Christian tradition. But what prevailed was the conviction, already accepted among the Protestants, that it is better for those reciting the Psalter not to face this problem. Hence, elimination of some psalms led also to elimination of difficulties related to them. I am not going to determine here whether precisely this simplification should have been avoided at any cost, but I would like to pose a question whether the principle of avoiding psychological difficulties or even any difficulties at all has not become the true and supreme principle of this forced reform, or generally of many other changes made within the frames of post-conciliar form of the liturgy. For it is hard to trace within its dynamics and clear demands an attempt to overcome some difficulties other than its simple elimination at the expense of the office. In the end, even the assumed ultimate goal of the reform, defined after all not as keeping the priest to any breviary, but as enabling them to recite it both consciously and in accordance with veritas horarum, was depicted in the very constitution on the liturgy as still a remote ideal, which we are to reach as far as this may be possible. But in the same time depends so much on modern conditions in which daily life has to be lived. The emphasis on adjusting the office to those conditions rather than adapting the rhythm of life to the office is even stronger in the Apostolic Constitution Laudis Canticum by Paul VI, that opens the Liturgy of the Hours. Hence, even the correspondence between particular hour and the time of day it is prayed is rather recommended than required. Taking into consideration those soft formulas and not utterly clear requirements, it is easy to foresee that, especially in the secularized world, the dictate of the absolutized modern conditions of life will rarely allow the priests to follow the whim of focusing on devoting themselves to prayer and to the ministry of the word. Or maybe we should immediately accept that within those conditions we live in, to speak colloquially, it is not going to be easy at any rate. Therefore, the easiness is not a suitable measure of a proper form of the office, and the conditions of life should also undergo adaptations to suit the divine service. Among the 4 adjectives used by the Council to describe the desired way of reciting the Reformed office, melius, better, perfectius, more perfectly, latius, more abundantly, et facilius, easier, only one seems to depict faithfully what was done to the breviary Psalter in the last reform. For we may not say that now the psalms are more extensively present. It is not obvious whether they are recited more perfectly. It is also questionable whether the arrangement is better, but without any doubt, presently it is easier. Still, I am not certain whether something easier is necessarily also more valuable. Thank you.